So time for Commissioner Hedegaard maybe to comment a little bit on what has been recommended and maybe also your role. Yeah.
Thank you very much, distinguished delegates of the Young European Council. Thank you very much, Pierre, for this presentation. I thought when I listened to you that, in fact, you should not have done this presentation here at the Young European Council. We have a real, you could call it, old European Council going on in a neighboring building here, where, as you might know, the heads of states today are going to decide, hopefully, the climate and energy targets for 2030 for Europe. And I noticed that one of your main points, that was on energy systems, and you pointed out especially energy efficiency. And to me, to say that Europe, one of the most energy import dependent continents on planet Earth, that we should focus more on energy efficiency, to me that is a no-brainer. But unfortunately I happen to know that in this building not too long from here, that's one of the things that are being discussed, because there are some heads of states who think that there is no reason to sort of have a strong EU focus on energy efficiency. I don't know if you know, every year in Europe, the 28 member states, we spend 400 billion euros to pay for our imported oil, coal and gas. 400 billion euros every year. That's a lot of money. You know where the 140 billion euros end up? In Putin's Russia. Those who tell me that it's not a good idea these days to do more on energy efficiency in Europe, I must just say I don't get what would be the idea in that. It's some of the things that can create more jobs. It's some of the things that can bring down energy costs. The cheapest energy is the energy we don't use. And at the same time, of course, it can do something good for the climate. It could also help us to export more, because on other continents, they will also be looking for more energy efficient, resource efficient solutions. So I thought that this one of your recommendations is a very, very important one. You also mentioned waste, food waste, energy waste, water waste, food and water, I think you mentioned specifically. It is shocking, isn't it, that 30% of all the food being produced in Europe is thrown out as waste. 30%. It is literally millions of tons of food every year that we throw out in Europe. While we still, globally, are talking about 800 million people who will go hungry to bed tonight. There's something wrong in the way we construct the things. And that is why in this commission we have been looking very much on not only energy efficiency, but resource efficiency. But I like your point on waste very much. And also what you touched upon, that would take politics, how to recycle things, how to reuse things. We have put up standards for that in Europe. But it also points to what you also mentioned, the personal responsibility. Because in the kind of society I would like to live in, I do not want the politicians to tell me every sort of single detail of how I'm going to live my life. But if I want to avoid that, if I want politicians to deal with the overall targets, how do we price pollution? How do we regulate how much the cars can pollute, how much the trucks can pollute, things like that? Then there rests a core of political responsibility with each of us. For instance, when it comes to food waste, water waste, each of us in the privileged part of the world, we have a special responsibility. It's also about the way we consume. So that was another of your point. And I would just mention this, a third point you mentioned very much, of course, the cities. As more than 70% of the Europeans are living in cities, it's clear that that is also where many of our emissions stem from, that's where many of our pollution problems would come from. But it's actually also one of the areas where we know what we could do and what we could do smarter. For instance, city planning. There's a lot we can do by planning smarter. thinking our solutions much more integrated. That's what I've been trying now as 5 years as EU's climate commissioner, to say things about climate and environment, that should not come as an afterthought when you have taken care of all the other things. And oh, we should also remember the environment and the climate. No, it should be integrated in the projects from the start. If you define a new public transport system, if you establish a new quota, you have a new industrial area you want to sort of start, from the very beginning you should think about what are the low carbon solutions? What are the energy efficient and resource efficient solutions? What is the smart way of commuting here? We know where the good solutions are. It's more about how we bring it to scale and how we take care that we actually use the knowledge about best practices that we have. And I'll just give you a final example. For instance, you mentioned pollution from transport. I was almost late here. Transport in Brussels is absolutely hopeless. I come from Copenhagen in Denmark, where 36% of all transport between home and job will be done by bike. When I moved here to Brussels, what I really first noticed was the windows. You have to clean them all the time because they are black of particles. That's very, very concrete kind of evidence that something is not sort of working well enough. What can we do at the European level and things like that? Well, we could try, as we have been doing in the last 5 years, set up standards for cars. How much can they pollute? How can we bring down the pollution? How can we make them run longer on a liter of gasoline or diesel? We've done the same for vans. We're now preparing it for trucks. We can put up standards for fuels so that we will compete on a level playing field among the 28. We will not compete on the lowest common denominator when it comes to environment. So that's where Europe also has some added value in setting up common regulations, common standards. If I have a voice for it, comment on the, no, just finishing that. What we actually have done as a novelty is in the whole EU budget for the next 7 years, we have said that at least 20% of the whole budget must be spent in a way that promotes our climate targets. Why is that important? Because that means that if you're a state or an industry, a business or a municipality, a region that wants money out of the EU system, it is easier for you to get money out of the system if your project does something good for climate and environment. If you're a farmer, you will only get the last 30% of your income support if you're doing something for the common good. Our development system will mainstream climate thinking in it, and so on and so forth, all the sectors, transport, buildings, research, what have we. That is a new way of making an annual budget. That you don't think of energy, environment, climate as the last thing, or we need a little budget for that. You think it into all the other sectors. I think that's a way to take care that the bill you get when you're sitting here not as the young parliament or the young European Council, but as the real sort of decision makers 20 years from now, then that the bill we have sent to you will be less. There are intelligent ways of taking care of that. And the very last thing I would mention was that Pierre mentioned that citizens should be part of the transformation. I think, as I've said, it's absolutely key. So I hope that through this exercise you have been through now, thinking about the solutions, that when you come back home, it's not just that was an interesting experience for these days in Brussels, but I hope that you will really stick to this, because I think that like states or regions like the EU can set a good example. I also think that citizens can send a really good signal by actually acting in their daily life as they think we should all be acting. It would help quite a bit if 500 million Europeans started to have a more sustainable lifestyle. So I'll stop there before I start coughing again, and then I hope there will be some questions.
Thank you very much. And, I can only, what you said, the importance of looking ahead and changing policies, I would say, actually, the future is sitting right in front of you, and there's actually looking ahead, so I think we're hopefully better track than so far. If you want to comment directly on that, otherwise, would open to the word maybe to a panel or to other Q&A questions.
Yeah, just a quick statement to give time to my delegates to ask a question. First of all, I'm really delighted to see you show concern on the field of sustainable development in cities. And I think I'm speaking for all of us to say it's a real honor to have you here tonight and to share with you the communique with you. So thank you for that. I know my delegates and my deputy assistants have a lot of questions for you concerning the communique we made, and I think precise points, so I will open the floor. Just raise your hand and ask the question directly to the Commissioner. Thank you.
I'll try to do it briefly. I agree very much with what you said on green public procurement. We tried in the Energy Efficiency Directive actually to put an annual quota on how much of the public building mass that the member states must retrofit, must make more energy efficient. It works, and they do not do it automatically, so it helps to have some targets to say this is an obligation you have according to EU rule. That's just one example. But your question goes deeper than that, because, you know, if you're a finance minister, and you think, oh, this green public procurement, you know, I just want to get the cheapest this or the cheapest that, whatever I need. And that is where I think we need to change our mindset. We need to get away from believing that what is cheapest in the short term is also the cheapest solution in the longer term. We must think more in terms of co-benefits, in running costs, in the longer term, and things like that. And the sooner we start to realize that what is cheapest here and now is not necessarily the cheapest solution, the more sustainable choices we are going to make. So that's just if I should put it very briefly. And then you mentioned what can people do, for instance, with buildings. We did one thing when I was a minister in Denmark that I think works very well. If you put an obligation to the energy companies, the company that is heating the building you're living in, delivering the energy for the building you're living in, and tell them that each year they should save so and so much of their total energy consumption. Then it's very clear to see what is happening then. Then they start to go out to the big customers in the industry, to the big house with many tenants, and say, maybe we could help you. We are the specialists in energy. Maybe we can help you to save energy, and at the same time you can save money. And we can even co-finance some of the investment, so that what you save, say in the first 5 years or 10 years, half of it goes to us, half of it goes to you, but then we will finance the investment. So there are some alternative ways of getting it done also in the building mass. But I think requirements to the energy sector is a very efficient tool here. That's also why I hope, still fingers crossed, that our heads of states will adopt not only a CO2 reduction target tonight, but also a target for renewables and a target for energy efficiency. Because that would make more and more people think about new energy efficient solutions and new renewable investments. And that's why we need 3 targets, not just 1.
Thank you, Commissioner. Another question? Christopher?
Thank you very much, Honourable Commissioner. Recently, I read the report, the draft report of the ICPP for the synthesis report of 2013. Some of the main aspects of the specific issue were the international and regional governance and the cooperation. And the second aspect was about the financial instruments and the financial incentives that the European Commission and the European Union may provide to citizens, companies, and to their interaction. So I have two questions. First of all, we have many cases in the USA that they have tax exemptions in case they provide greener engines or greener infrastructures. We have also like the initiative of green infrastructure bonds, so they can be repaid later by public benefit funding. And the second one is that, as you have mentioned in one of your speeches, when we're talking about air pollution, it's not something that it's national, but it's cross-border. So my two questions, first of all, what can the European Commission and the European Union do to provide financial incentives to citizens and to companies? And the second one is, what has the European Union done wrong till now in order to promote the cooperation of the European Union with countries outside of the European Union, such as China, India or Pakistan, which are the main pollutants of air right now? Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was very big and very relevant questions. To the first part of the tax exemptions, you mentioned US as an example. Many of our member states have different kind of tax exemptions. And that is an authority that we have put out with member states more than at the European level. What we've done at the European level is we can set aside money, as I mentioned, through the budget for investments. We can use the European Investment Bank. You mentioned green bonds. Actually, the European Investment Bank, the latest figure I heard was 26 billion they now have in green bonds. So they are among the leading in the world, the leading banks in the world when it comes to green bonds. So we have some big institutions that can do something. We can, as I mentioned, mainstream climate thinking into our whole EU budget. So if you want structural funds, regional funds, support for whatever, then you must go green in order to get the money. A lot of the regions you will come from, they will get money out of the EU budget. In the next 7 years, it's more likely that they get money out of the EU budget if they do something in the energy efficiency area, energy infrastructure area, or renewables area. So there's a very, very strong priority to that. But the exemption for the individual citizen will often come from the national level. We have, of course, one exception from that, and that is the carbon price that we have. And without going into too many details there will be problems with that carbon market during the crisis, to put it mildly. But we have this, that we are putting a price on carbon, and provided that our heads of states today will adopt the targets for 2030, already next week, the environment ministers will start to deal with the Commission's very concrete legislative proposal how to improve the carbon price in Europe. That is also setting a very strong price signal. What have we done with other countries in that line? One of the things we have been doing in recent years, we are cooperating with China. How can they put a price on carbon? How can they start to put a price on pollution? That's just one example. And they are actually now doing it in 7 pilot schemes for 250 million people. It's a relatively big pilot scheme, I would say. And the expectation is by 2020 that they will have a national price on carbon in China. We have very much worked with them how they could get this up and running. So that's a very concrete example of how we are working with them. And then, of course, finally, we are working with the US, with India, with China, with all players in the international climate talks in order to get everybody on board. Because we can do a lot in Europe. We have a moral obligation, in my view, to do it. It's one of the most prosperous parts of the world. It's also our self-interest to be less dependent on imported fossil fuels. But, of course, there's a limit as to how much we can do if other big emitters are also not doing their fair share. And I would say one of the things I'm most proud of internationally in my 5 years as a climate commissioner, that was at the International Climate Conference in Durban in South Africa in 2011, when we had a very tough strategy on EU side, when we managed to speak with one voice, meaning all 28 member states stuck to our strategy and conveyed the same kind of messages. And we played it very, very tough with the US, with India, and with China, saying, listen guys, in the world of the 21st century, it cannot be only those countries who were developed back when the Climate Convention of the UN was done back in 1992. Only those countries cannot be the only ones who have the commitment to contribute to solve this problem. In the real world we are living in today, the world has changed. New strong economies have emerged, and they must also take their fair share of this responsibility. And we won that battle. So that is now why when we are heading towards the next year's climate conference in Paris, it's based on the result there in 2011, saying that all countries, rich and poor, developed as well as developing, all will have to do something. Of course, those of us who are rich will have to do more than those who are very poor, but all of us must commit to pursue a more sustainable development strategy. So that was sort of the big game there, and that is what the very big battle will be all about up to the International Climate Conference in Paris next year. And I'm sure you will hear a lot more about it in the next 12 months.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. One last question, if you're okay. Martina?
Commissioner, my name is Martina, I'm from Italy. You spoke about planning smarter. So in this case, in our panel, we discussed about urban and peri-urban agriculture to strengthening the cooperation between the city and the areas surrounding them. So my question is, in your opinion, can agriculture play a role in the fight against the climate change? And if yes, how it can do it?
Well, agriculture has to play a role because it's a very significant sector. That is, by the way, also one of the big obstacles that they are negotiating tonight. Should agriculture be part of this, or should they not be so much part of this? It goes without saying that our transport sector, our building sector, and our agricultural sector, they also have to be part of the solution. What can be done? Well, if just we applied all the best practices that we already have, that will bring us quite some way. We could still have more and more intensive way of using the soil to get more yield out of sort of the same area that we are cultivating. Of course, we also need, this is an area where we need a lot of more research, for instance, on cattle and on pigs and things like that. But just take one example. If the waste, the sewage coming out from the what is called the cattle and the pigs and things like that, if we use that for biogasification, that would solve a huge environmental problem. It could be a renewable energy source. It is almost taking off at a bigger scale in Europe, but it has been harmed a bit by the crisis, where it has been difficult to get things invested. So that's also an area where more targeted investment programs into new climate-friendly technologies, environment-friendly technologies, could actually help a lot. And that would also, in my eyes, it should also be seen as a positive vision from the agricultural sector, because then they would not be seen as much as an environmental problem, but as someone who actually helps us to solve problems we have. They could be energy providers instead of sort of bad environment providers, so to speak. Last thing I could mention there, you know, we have had this very big and very heated discussion on first-generation biofuels. Should we have first-generation biofuels? Crops that can be used for food, should that be used for our cars? To put it a bit too simply, but that's what is happening. I've said no, we must stop that. We cannot in Europe build a huge industry on first-generation biofuels. Of course you need first generation before you can get to the second and third generation more advanced biofuels. That is logic. But we must freeze the production of first-generation biofuels at the present level, so that for the future, the new industries we create, that will be on algae, on things that cannot be used for food consumption. Because it goes without saying that if you use wheat or maize, corn, and turn it into energy, into fuel, then the food prices will increase. Will the farmers think that's a good idea? Yes, a lot of farmers would think that's a good idea, because they do not, of course, care that much if only the price would go up. But we can all see that in a world with still more people that we need to feed on planet Earth, that is not a sustainable way of moving forward. And it will get a more and more moral issue. So I think it's better to sort of put a ceiling on that. And that's we have proposed from the Commission. First, the European Council, the government said, no, we cannot support this. Now they have had second thoughts. They tried to dilute it a bit, but now they said maybe we can at least accept most of it, also so that we do not subsidize first-generation biofuels after 2020. And in a month's time or so, the European Parliament will hopefully also give their endorsement. That would mean that we would stop producing more first-generation biofuels. I think that's a very important contribution.
Well, thank you, Commissioner, and once again, thank you for being here tonight and answering our concern. I don't know if you want to take another question or if it's too late.
I think actually in the interest of time, we unfortunately have to cut it short here. Thank you very much, of course, Mr. Commissioner, for spending time with us and receiving the final communique. You're here for presenting your outcome, and of course the chairs for actually delivering the actual outcomes. Both very stimulating for our side, I think, and very inspiring. And I hope actually that you could also be a bit inspired to you and your colleagues could learn something from the young people, from the young people's voice, and that all communicating can reform the policymaking.
Thank you very much. Yes, it was inspiring to be here, but I hope you will go home now from wherever you come and remember these messages, because there is a tendency in many places that always something else is more important. The economy, or Ukraine, or Ebola, or whatever. But you know, the challenge we have with climate change and natural resources will not disappear by itself. So it's extremely important that there are some conscious citizens out there and not forgetting these key messages. So thank you a lot for the interest. And then please help me cross your fingers for the heads of states.
You always share your
That's good.